In the foggy dawn of 17th of November, 1968, the freighter Scheersburg A eased away from the quay in Antwerp's port district, a Liberian flag lifting in the cold air. Beneath her steel deck sat 560 drums of yellowcake uranium, stenciled with a single word, plumbat. Port records would later show a routine departure bound for Genoa, Italy. Nothing in the paperwork suggested that the cargo would vanish. Decades later, a Time magazine investigation would trace this moment as the start of one of the most audacious nuclear smuggling operations of the Cold War. On deck, crewmen moved through ordinary motions, securing lines, checking gauges, stamping a date into the ship's log. What they said, what they feared, the record does not preserve. It preserves only this. 15 days later, the same vessel would dock at Iskenderun, Turkey, riding strangely high in the water, her holds empty. In European archives, this became a mystery shipment. In Israeli accounts, mostly unwritten, it would be remembered as Operation Plumbat. By summer 1967, in the months following the Six-Day War, Israel's nuclear project at Dimona entered a new phase of anxiety. France, which had quietly supplied uranium and technical support throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, had now pulled back. President Charles de Gaulle's embargo, formalized after the war, cut off fuel for the Negev reactor at a moment when Israel's regional security calculations had never felt more precarious. Within Israeli intelligence circles, the problem was defined with bureaucratic calm. The country needed fresh uranium ore without calling attention to itself or violating Euratom controls. In the background stood Lachem, the Bureau of Scientific Relations, and Mossad, whose remit had already expanded to strategic procurement. Later analyses would note that, by 1968, Israel's policy of nuclear opacity was being constructed, not only in laboratories, but also in shipping offices and shell corporations. In Brussels and Antwerp, the Belgian company Union Minière still controlled stocks of uranium oxide mined years earlier at Shinkolobwe in the Belgian Congo, the same region that had once fed the Manhattan Project. Its leftover inventory, roughly 200 tons of yellowcake, would become the target. Writers and regulators would later describe a crucial political calculation. An open purchase of such quantities risked diplomatic confrontation. A secret one risked international scandal if exposed. The choice of the covert route reveals an early decision about methods and about acceptable risk. In official chronologies, this appears as a policy problem. In practice, it meant turning nuclear strategy into a freight movement and tying national security to the fate of one anonymous ship's crew. While memos accumulated in European capitals, a plan began to form around a freighter no one had heard of yet. On 19th of August 1968, in Zurich, a Swiss lawyer named Gera Lanz was retained to establish a new shipping company under the Liberian flag of convenience. Within 24 hours, the Biscayne Traders Shipping Corporation existed on paper in Monrovia. Little more than a postal address and a corporate seal. By 27th of September 1968, Biscayne Traders had purchased a small German-built freighter, the Scheersburg, from the Hamburg brokerage August Bolton. For approximately $287,000, the vessel changed hands and names, becoming Scheersburg A under the Liberian registry. Corporate records later examined by journalists and European investigators showed that the company's president was Dan Ert, later known as Dan Erbel, a Danish-Israeli citizen who would eventually admit in Norwegian custody following an unrelated incident that he was a Mossad operative. None of this appeared unusual in real time. Flags of convenience, opaque ownership chains, and one-ship companies were standard in late 1960s maritime commerce. What made Biscayne Traders different? was that it was ultimately an instrument of an intelligence service rather than a commercial fleet. Retrospective accounts by several investigative writers would later map out this architecture as the first layer of Operation Plumbat's cover. On registry forms, this was routine registration. Only decades later would the handwriting on those documents be read as part of a covert nuclear supply line. With a ship and a flag secured, the next question was simple and dangerous. What would they put in its holds? In mid-1968, the German firm Asmara Chemie applied for permission to purchase 200 tons of uranium oxide from Union Miniere, with onward shipment from Antwerp to Italy. The declared end user was an Italian company called Saica, a small paint and dye manufacturer in Milan with no known experience handling nuclear materials. Euratom, the European atomic energy watchdog, approved the transaction after reviewing Asmara's guarantees and financial backing. Later, Belgian and European accounts would underline how slender those checks were. Euratom staff verified that Asmara could pay the approximately $3.7 million cost, but did not question why a paint firm needed uranium, or why the shipment would briefly pass through Genoa before reaching Milan. These gaps would become critical once the uranium vanished. Behind the scenes, sources suggest that officials in Bonn quietly tolerated this paper trail, seeing advantage in technical cooperation with Israel. The shipment's declared path, Union Miniere to Asmara Chemie to Saica, provided political cover for all parties involved. In November, workers at Antwerp's port prepared 560 drums for loading. The drums were stenciled with the word plumbat, a lead-related term that disguised the uranium oxide within. That word, neutral, almost dull, would become the physical motif of the entire affair. On the quay, plumbat looked like thousands of other consignment codes. Only on paper did the cargo's true nature exist, and only in a few locked filing cabinets. When the drums left European soil, the oversight that had allowed them to move would struggle to admit they were gone. The uranium inside those plumbat drums had its own history. It originated with Union Miniere, whose operations at Shinkolobwe, in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, had once produced some of the richest uranium ore on Earth. The same mining network had supplied uranium for the Manhattan Project and, indirectly, for early American and German nuclear research programs. By 1968, these stocks were described as leftover inventory, processed yellowcake sitting in Belgian-controlled warehouses awaiting buyers. The ore's journey from Congolese shafts to European drums and, eventually, to a Mediterranean freighter encapsulated the global commerce of atomic materials. Colonial extraction, corporate consolidation, and Cold War demand. Later writers would connect Shinkolobwe's output to multiple nuclear programs, arguing that secrecy around these flows made accountability nearly impossible. In their work, Operation Plumbat appears as one more turn in a long chain, where uranium moved faster than regulation could follow. For Israeli planners in Tel Aviv and at Dimona, the uranium's origin mattered less than its potential. According to former regulators and analysts, 200 tons of yellowcake could fuel a reactor like Dimona's for years, supporting both civilian cover and weapons-related plutonium production. In ledgers, the cargo was a commodity measured in tons and dollars. In strategic calculations, it was time. Years of reactor operation quietly purchased in advance. Before the uranium ever reached the sea, it had already passed through enough hands that no single actor felt wholly responsible for it. The Scheersburg A, built in 1955 at the Kruger shipyard in Rendsburg, was a modest freighter of about 1,190 gross tons. For most of its life, under the German owner August Bolton, it had carried routine cargo around European and Mediterranean ports: grain, machinery, industrial supplies. Nothing in its previous voyages suggested it would become central to a nuclear smuggling operation. By October 1968, under Biscayne traders' ownership, the vessel had been refitted and reflagged. When it arrived in Rotterdam in mid-November, its crew, largely Spanish seamen, were told the vessel had been sold again and their services were no longer required. According to later reporting, a new crew was then assembled, composed of individuals selected by Mossad and equipped with forged passports supplied through Biscayne traders' paperwork. The ship's declared route, Antwerp to Genoa, appeared on manifests and in Euratom documentation. Port schedules listed it among many small freighters making similar trips. The vessel's anonymity was its greatest protection. No one outside a small network of planners in Israel and cooperating officials in Europe had reason to mark its name. In maritime registers today, Felkraus, the ship's later names and sales are recorded. At the time, none of those entries mentioned uranium. The target of the operation was not only the yellowcake, but also this obscurity, the ability to move a dangerous cargo under the cover of normal shipping. The freighter's steel hull and small tonnage were ordinary. What made it extraordinary was that, for a brief period, its voyage carried more strategic weight than many warships. When the ship steamed into Antwerp that November, no external sign distinguished it from any other vessel. The difference was buried in its paperwork and in its future logbook. As the Scheersburg A prepared to load its cargo in Antwerp in November 1968, regulators in Brussels and Luxembourg continued to rely on Asmara Chemie's assurances. Internal Euratom discussions, later described in the press, acknowledged that the agency had not closely scrutinized the Italian end user, Saica, beyond accepting the firm's financial guarantees. Political writers have argued that some officials in West Germany saw value in quietly supporting Israel's nuclear ambitions, expecting technological cooperation in return. The Begin doctrine of preemption would later shape Israeli attacks on other regional nuclear projects. Plumbat sits earlier in that arc, as a procurement operation rather than a strike. When Paul Leventhal, then a United States Senate attorney, publicly revealed the missing uranium case at a disarmament conference in Salzburg in 1977, he highlighted not only the diversion but also the failure of European oversight. Subsequent commentary by non-proliferation groups would frame Plumbat as a cautionary tale about how civilian regulatory systems could be outpaced by intelligence services. For Mossad planners, these blind spots were not abstractions, but working assumptions. Their operation depended on regulators accepting paperwork at face value and on European governments choosing not to look too hard. The yellowcake moved not only because Israel planned well, but because others chose not to imagine that a whole ship's worth of uranium could vanish. When the last Euratom stamp was applied, the freighter's journey shifted from legal to clandestine, without a single camera rolling. On 16th and 17th of November 1968, dock workers in Antwerp harbor began loading 560 drums into the hold of the Scheersburg A. Each drum was labeled Plumbat, consistent with the shipping fiction that the freighter carried a derivative of lead destined for industrial use. In reality, the cargo was yellowcake uranium contracted through Asmara Chemie and Union Minière. By the morning fog of 17th November, the vessel was ready. The original Spanish-speaking crew, dismissed in Rotterdam days earlier, was gone. In their place, investigators later concluded, stood a hand-picked crew linked to Mossad, traveling under forged identities supplied via Biscayne traders' paperwork. No surviving documents record conversations on deck that morning. The cold air carried the smell of diesel and salt. Cranes swung the final drums into place while the harbor stirred with the first movements of the workday. What the archive does preserve are numbers. Gross tonnage, Cargo weight, departure time. The absence of detail, no photographs of the loading, no surviving port inspection reports with annotations, is striking in retrospect. The most tangible motif remains the stenciled word on the barrels themselves. In historical reconstructions, those black letters, plumb bat, have become shorthand for a deception that was as much bureaucratic as maritime. For the dock workers, it was just another code. Once the ship cleared the Scheldt estuary, its cargo left not only Belgian waters, but also the last place where anyone had officially seen it. From 17th November to 2nd December 1968, the Scheersburg A sailed a route that has been partially reconstructed and partially disputed. One influential investigation, drawing on an anonymous seaman's testimony and shipping records, described the ship moving through the English Channel, around Spain, and into the Mediterranean, maintaining radio silence during key stretches. Books on the affair add further narrative detail. Calm seas in the days before entering the Mediterranean, a ship making its way toward a planned rendezvous rather than its declared destination of Genoa. According to these accounts, the Scheersburg A passed the Balearic Islands and instead of turning north toward Italy, continued east. Other reporting stresses what remains unknown. Euratom officials quoted at the time noted that how the uranium actually vanished remained open to speculation, offering competing theories: a hijacking at sea or a diversion to a Middle Eastern port. These cautionary notes underline that while many sources accept the ship-to-ship transfer story, hard forensic proof of the exact position and method remains elusive. Between departure and arrival, the freighter occupied a space where logs can be torn, radios can stay quiet, and later testimony can remain anonymous. Intelligence operations thrive in that gap. The sea absorbed whatever happened. The only certainty was the outcome. The ship left Antwerp heavy with uranium and would arrive in Turkey light. Whatever happened next, it had to be completed before the vessel could credibly appear in a Turkish port without its most valuable cargo. Several converging accounts describe a nighttime rendezvous in the eastern Mediterranean around late November 1968. In this version, the Scheersburg A met an Israeli freighter, escorted by naval vessels, somewhere east of Crete or near the waters between Cyprus and Turkey. In near total darkness, winches lifted the 560 plumb-bat drums from one ship to the other, while crews maintained strict silence. The uranium, these sources argue, was then carried toward Haifa before its eventual delivery to processing facilities associated with Dimona. The Scheersburg A, now empty, turned toward Iskenderun on the Turkish coast. However, other contemporary reporting emphasizes that Euratom never conclusively established the exact method or location of the diversion. Officials frame the ship-to-ship transfer as a plausible scenario, not a proven fact, noting alternative possibilities. Some suggested the cargo could have been offloaded at a small Mediterranean port with cooperative officials. Others speculated about more elaborate arrangements. What is firmly documented is the outcome. The ship left Antwerp with uranium and arrived in Iskenderun without it. The uranium never reached its declared Italian recipient. Between those points lies a gap filled by overlapping but not fully verifiable narratives. Intelligence histories often rest on such seams: part document, part testimony, part silence. The human reality is that dozens of people must have handled those drums. Almost none are on the record. When the Scheersburg A entered Turkish waters, the most important part of its voyage was already over. And officially, it had never happened. Port records show the Scheersburg A arriving in Iskenderun, Turkey, on 2nd December 1968, riding higher in the water than a fully loaded ship would. The cargo that should have continued to Genoa and then to Syca in Milan was no longer in the holds. Turkish port officials recorded the arrival without apparent suspicion. A few days later, on 5th December, many of the original Spanish crew members, previously dismissed in Rotterdam, were summoned to rejoin the freighter in Palermo. Curious about its recent voyage, some examined the ship's log. They found that the pages covering roughly the previous 2.5 weeks, the period between Antwerp and Iskenderun, had been torn out. The Italian paint firm Syca, whose chairman Francesco Sertorio later spoke to journalists, was informed by Asmara Chemi that the ship had been lost and was told to keep an advance payment of approximately $12,000. Sertorio later recalled his suspicion about the unusual uranium transaction, but he had no way to verify what had happened at sea. For Euratom, the combination of an empty arrival, missing log pages, and unfulfilled delivery eventually triggered an investigation. The Scheersburg A soon left Iskenderun and resumed ordinary freight duties under the same or later names, its brief role in nuclear history undocumented in its official maritime record. In the shipping world, missing log pages are a red flag. In the world of intelligence operations, they are also an achievement, evidence that the most sensitive moments have been deliberately erased. By the time inspectors began asking questions, the ship was already back in circulation, its holds filled with more mundane cargo, and its most important trip reduced to a gap. It took months for Euratom and European officials to fully register that 200 tons of uranium oxide had effectively disappeared. Internal reports, later referenced by journalists in Europe and the United States, pieced together the transaction. Union Minier's sale, Asmara Chemi's contracts, Syca's role, and the freighter's diversion. A Euratom investigation concluded that the uranium never reached Genoa, and that the Scheersburg A had disappeared from tracking for about a year, reappearing under a different flag and with a different name. The Plumbat Affair label began circulating within specialist circles, referencing the stenciled code on the missing drums. In May 1977, Paul Leventhal publicly outlined the affair at a disarmament conference, estimating that the stolen yellowcake could fuel a reactor like Demona's for up to a decade. Shortly afterward, major magazine and newspaper investigations brought the case into wider public view. Time magazine's coverage helped establish the basic narrative that would frame subsequent accounts. European officials faced a dilemma: acknowledge a spectacular regulatory failure or minimize its implications. Public statements tended to emphasize uncertainty about the uranium's final destination, even as many non-proliferation analysts pointed toward Israel. Official Israeli responses combined silence and categorical denials. The investigation turned a missing cargo into a political embarrassment. Yet the people who had moved the drums were never publicly named, and the states involved had little appetite to push harder. As the affair entered the press, the Plumbat barrels were already, by most accounts, inside a closed nuclear fuel cycle that no inspector could access. By the late 1970s, independent researchers, building on American and European sources, argued that Operation Plumbat had directly supported Israel's undeclared nuclear arsenal by supplying fuel to Dimona. Chronologies compiled by non-proliferation organizations later summarized the operation as a combined Mossad action that diverted approximately 200 tons of yellowcake to Israel. The technical implications mattered. Yellowcake is not weapons-grade material, but as former regulators noted, it is the raw input for reactors that can produce plutonium-239. In that sense, Plumbat was less about a single weapon and more about sustaining a long-term production capability under a policy of deliberate ambiguity. For Israel, the operation fit into a broader pattern. Allegations surrounding the NUMEC facility in Pennsylvania during the 1960s, cooperation with France in the 1950s and early 1960s, and later preventive strikes such as Operation Opera against Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981. Together, these actions trace a doctrine where nuclear security is pursued through quiet acquisitions and, when necessary, overt force. The human dimension remains harder to reconstruct. We know names on documents: Dan Ert, corporate officers, regulators, journalists, but not the inner states of the operatives who arranged shell companies, swapped crews, and watched the drums lift from one deck to another. Their psychological burden is inferred from consequences rather than described in memoirs. Strategically, Plumbat worked. The uranium disappeared from European control and almost certainly entered Israel's nuclear fuel cycle. Morally, the operation lives in a gray zone, promoted by some as existential necessity, condemned by others as dangerous precedent. Years later, when other states attempted similar evasions, Plumbat was one of the cases cited. Proof that once such a path is walked, it can be walked again. The most personal glimpse into Operation Plumbat comes indirectly through a very different case. In July 1973, in Lillehammer, Norway, a Mossad team assassinated Ahmed Bouchiki, a Moroccan waiter, mistakenly believing him to be Ali Hassan Salameh, a Palestinian militant connected to the Munich Olympics attack. Norwegian authorities arrested several team members, including Dan Ert, seeking to convince his interrogators that he was not a common criminal but an intelligence officer. Ert reportedly recounted his role in earlier operations. Journalistic investigations and corporate records later confirmed that he had been listed as president of Biscayne Traders Shipping Corporation, the Liberian company that owned the Shearsburg A during the Plumbat affair. In this way, a botched assassination in Norway illuminated a successful nuclear smuggling operation years earlier. The two stories sit uneasily together. One a textbook example of clandestine logistics, the other a case of lethal misidentification. Together, they sketch the career of at least one operative whose work spanned both. Writers and analysts have used this juxtaposition to question whether the skills, habits, and moral compromises developed in operations like Plumbat might also shape later misjudgments. No transcript of Ert's full Norwegian testimony is publicly available. What exists is a paper trail. Court documents from Lillehammer, Liberian corporate records, shipping registries, and scattered press interviews. Through them, we glimpse a man whose name sits at the intersection of a missing uranium shipment and a wrongful killing. For Dan Ert, the same tradecraft that enabled the silent transfer of 560 Plumbat drums did not prevent a fatal error in a Scandinavian town. The inner cost of that trajectory, pride, guilt, rationalization, remains unrecorded. What reaches the archive are signatures and vessel names. Not the moment when an operative realizes that a life or a ship's cargo cannot be put back. In a photograph reproduced in several later accounts, workers in Antwerp stand beside drums marked Plumbat, the lettering stark against metal. The image does not show the transfer at sea, the missing log pages, or the conversations in Zurich and Tel Aviv that made those drums more than industrial freight. It shows only men, barrels, and a key. The same word, Plumbat, appears in Uranium files, in Leventhal's conference notes, in non-proliferation chronologies, and in scattered shipping documents. Each time, it is a small detail in a larger text. Viewed now, that stencil becomes a quiet emblem of the affair. A label meant to conceal, preserved as the most tangible trace. The sea is absent, the ships unnamed, the uranium invisible. What remains is a single word on a drum. ordinary paint over extraordinary risk, still legible long after the cargo itself has vanished.